Welcome back to Mr. Orth's Flipped Classroom. Today, let's take a look at the elements of fiction in review. This is intended for grade 9 students, but can be appropriate for students at all levels. First, let's take the term narrative. Most students want to start by talking about stories. Well, for our purposes, let's redefine the term story as the word narrative, in the sense that it's storytelling. See, narratives can be fiction and nonfiction and poetry, as well as drama, movies, television shows, and art. Narratives aren't just stories and novels. The first major element we're going to talk about is plot. First, we'll define plot as a sequence of events in a narrative. However, just having a list of events in order doesn't necessarily make something into a plot. We need to know the conflict. In order to determine all the different elements in a plot, you have to know what the conflict is. Once you have the conflict, you can look at in the story or the plot when the conflict begins, when it changes, and when it's over. In that case, you have essentially a timeline of a story, but it's broken or turned at 3 different points. And those are the 3 points that actually allow you to label the elements of a plot. The first term often associated with a plot is the exposition. This is oftentimes the opening of the story, where the author reveals, or in this case, to use the term literally, exposes the characters and or the setting. If you think of it as simple as, once upon a time in a land called blank, there lived a blank. In the fairy tale starter, we've got time and place, once upon a time in a land called, and then we also start with characters. As that example moves forward, the initiating incident, the event which begins or reveals the conflict, could be corresponding to, and then one day. The and then one day in a story is actually where the plot happens. The exposition may not necessarily actually include any events, but it is placed in that part of the story. After the initiating incident starts that conflict, then the story continues to build through the rising action, which goes from the initiating incident through to the climax. The climax we'll consider to be the turning point of the narrative. This is in quotation marks because it may not be a literal turn. But the climax can also be considered the point from which the end has been set in motion. Some will also call it the point of no return. At that point in time, once you reach the climax of a story, the ending is going to be somewhat a foregone conclusion. The characters really can't escape it. The next part of a plot is called the falling action. This is the arc for the events leading from the climax to the end of the narrative. The next major point in the terms of the plot is how the main character resolves or ends the conflict. That's the resolution. Some stories have a reaction. A reaction is any event that follows the resolution. It's what you see after the fact. It might be something as simple as the hero or heroine, kissing the love interest at the end of the story, knowing that everyone's safe. It might be some kind of celebration or party and Ewoks dancing in the forest. Not every story has one. Reaction is definitely not how the characters feel about the resolution and how the reader feels. It's exclusively about how the characters feel about the resolution or what happens thereafter. Please note, not every story, especially short stories, has a reaction. I've already touched on it, but the second major element of a narrative is a conflict. Conflict can have several definitions. We'll use the problem that lies at the heart of a story. One of the more important things to know is that without a conflict to tie events together, your story is nothing more than a sequence of events, like a schedule. Perhaps like listening to a very young child tell about what happened in a day, but they're not necessarily being a point. It's just a retelling of what happened in order. There are 2 main types of conflict. We'll categorize them as internal and external. Internal would be problems that exist within someone, usually within someone's mind or someone's heart. Or external would be problems that result from someone's interaction with the world. We can break those down into more types as well. For example, an internal conflict will oftentimes label as character versus self. You might see some different instructors use terms like person versus, but we're going to use character versus because not all characters are people. An internal or character versus self conflict most commonly is some kind of difficult decision. It has to be made one way or the other. You'll find that in every story, even ones that have more external conflicts at the core of them, oftentimes the main character has to make some kind of choice, whether it's to stand and fight or to run away and avoid the conflict altogether. External conflicts tend to fall into one of 3 categories, although there is some overlap. Character versus character, it's direct conflict between 2 or more characters, and that can easily be group versus group. Character versus nature, and it could be animals, weather, but also things that are more obscure or not as obvious, like disease or old age or death. That's part of nature as well. Character versus society is a problem that not every student has heard of, at least before they reach 9th grade. Character versus society is where one or more characters fight a great wrong or injustice created by an entire group or culture. It's one versus the world, if you will. Think about gossip and that sort of thing, and that might be those kinds of stories. Most probably would be character versus society, but there will probably be one or two characters that stand out to make it character versus character as well. Speaking of characters, we'll define characters as the personalities that are directly present in the narrative. They have to be seen or heard to be in the narrative. So if someone's simply mentioned or referenced, it doesn't make them necessarily a character in the story until they show up. Also note, we're going to use personalities here because a character does not have to be human, as too many Disney movies attest. For character, I use the 3 A's and the I to describe character. It's also a helpful way for writers to make sure they're not simply giving name and standard basic information that might find in a birth certificate or a driver's license, but really get into descriptions of the character on many levels. Identity answers the question, who or what am I? Things like name, age, ethnicity, gender, job title, that's identity. Appearance is not just how a character looks, but any of the 5 senses as relates to the character. It can be how a character sounds, especially sound of voice, how a character might feel to the touch, how a character even might taste or smell. For a taste, it might seem odd, but if you think about the movie Spaceballs by Mel Brooks and the character Pizza the Hut, and taste is relevant. Most oftentimes, it's just awkward. Also, we have attitude. Attitude here isn't just the attitude as we think about it with a capital A for someone who has a lot of it, but attitude considering the thoughts, beliefs, and feelings of a character. And those may or may not be expressed out loud. It may simply be the internal expressions of a character. That's especially true with certain kinds of points of view in storytelling. Actions of a character, as we'll define them, aren't going to be just what a character does. It also includes the words that a character says. It's especially useful when you have dialogue and that dialogue reveals things about characters. It's easy to see how a character's sound of a character's voice might give you an idea about what their attitude might be, but just because a character is shouting doesn't necessarily mean that they're angry. It could mean they're very excited. So be careful when you're recording information. Do so very factually and literally, and not necessarily interpret those, especially from one A to another. Well, let's talk about character types here. There's several that come in pairs. First, major and minor. Some people use the idea of main, we'll come back to that, however. A major character is characters about whom you read or see the most. They're most present in the story, and usually more central to the conflict. Minor characters are present less often in the story. Protagonists and antagonists. The protagonist is the character or characters, it could be plural, trying to positively resolve the conflict. Typically, a story is going to follow the protagonist through most of the events. It is possible to have more than one, and it's possible, especially stories like Rick Riordan's Percy Jackson series and related works, to have that point of view shift, and therefore feel like there's more than one protagonist, depending on which chapter you're in. Antagonists are characters opposing the protagonist. Not every story has an antagonist, depending on what type of conflict that it uses. Character versus character and character versus society definitely have antagonist characters. Character versus self doesn't necessarily qualify as an antagonist, and character versus nature, that tends to only really apply if you're treating an animal, for example, as an actual character. Oftentimes, they're just seen as part of acting on instinct, in which case they wouldn't really be an antagonist in this context of a character type. Round and flat characters. Both of these have to do with the A of attitude in describing a character. So round is a character that shows more than one side of his or her personality. They're going to have different emotions. Just because, for example, someone might be a little more shy at school and more outgoing at home, that makes them round. Doesn't mean they change, it just means that they show more than one side of the personality, depending on the environment they're in. Whereas a flat character really has only one set of emotions. And that character oftentimes, if you think about early stories, the villains oftentimes were very flat. They were simply mean and that's it. Whereas you take more modern adaptations, such as Dustin Hoffman playing Captain Hook in the movie Hook with Robin Williams, he had a lot more to him than just being mean. He had self-doubt and worry and concern and really low self-esteem. But in the end, we were made to remember that he's mostly a mean character. He would qualify as round, whereas in the Disney cartoons, usually he's a flat character. Dynamic and static are also paired. These have to do with both a combination of attitude and actions. So dynamic is a character whose actions reflect an internal change, or change of heart. Dynamic characters aren't ones simply that change costume or appearance. Something on the inside changes, and therefore they do something differently. You'll find this often true of kind of a tragic conversion, or a character who's on the side of evil or the bad guys decides to help the good guys, sometimes to their own detriment or demise. A static character is a character who simply does not change in terms of their attitude. They're the same character at the beginning as they are at the end, with no really blips in between. They might fake look like changing and pretend to, but they really are who they are and have always been. A few more to look at. Sympathetic and unsympathetic are also character types, and they are paired. Sympathetic and unsympathetic, though, have to do with how the audience feels about a character. If the audience feels happy for the character when that character is happy, meaning they have the same feeling, that's sympathetic. Unsympathetic characters is a character with whom the audience simply does not emotionally connect. Don't confuse that with a character that is meant to be someone you dislike, and you like the fact that they're unlikable. And that's another term which we're not going to worry about at this time. Two others which aren't paired are stock and foil. Stock is a predictable character type, usually because he or she is a version of a stereotype. If I talked about a character who has an eye patch, a peg leg, and a parrot on his shoulder walks around saying, "Arg!" you're pretty sure it's a pirate, and you should know what to expect, looking for treasure and probably doing other things that Jack Sparrow might do. A foil character, I would say this is the Disney rule. A foil character is a major character that serves as a mirror for a major character. So you have a character who's probably not as central to the story. The story might even be able to do without, but this foil allows that major character to talk to someone more often. If I think about one of my favorites, Aladdin, for example. You don't know what Jafar is really thinking without Iago. You don't have a good idea what Princess Jasmine thinks without Rajah the tiger. And without Abu the monkey, who knows what Aladdin's thinking. Heck, even the genie has the carpet. So everyone has a foil, and therefore we know what everyone feels in the story. That's a foil. All right, moving on here. Setting. Setting can actually be compared very easily to character. While setting includes both time and place, and make sure it's not just one or the other, many people tend to look at place as being the only part of time. Setting also can be described in terms of identity, appearance, actions, and attitude. Identity, what it is, or where it is, by label or name. Appearance, what you see there, hear there, smell there, etc. Actions, what kind of things happen there, and what kinds of things are said there. And attitude, what feeling characters have when they're in that place. Please remember that setting oftentimes evolves as a story evolves. Think about how a story might at one point or start out being fine and fair weather, but might turn stormy. That's part of changing the whole feel of the story as you go along as well. A couple other terms here. First, that relate to setting is foreshadowing. These are hints or clues about what might happen later in the narrative, especially great for establishing suspense. Also flashback, where the audience sees what happened at some point in the past. This could be the same as what was shown earlier, or it could be a changed version of the past with new details. So the reason that, however, that a flashback is valuable is mostly at what point in the story does it reveal or remind the audience of something. The key is just talking about it isn't enough. That's an illusion with an A. Flashback is where the story actually takes you there and shows you what took place. Theme versus subject. A lot of students get trucked up with this. But subject we're going to treat as a single word or two-word phrase that indicates the topic of a narrative, like friendship, racism, family, depression, teen issues. Whereas theme is a single sentence stating the message or lesson the author wanted the reader to learn about life in general. Another way to think of that might be to think of it like a moral to the story. There are other rules to go with themes, such as you don't want to use don't, you want to state them positively, and they should always be a complete sentence. And you don't need to mention details specific to the story, like pirates, for example. But the key is they should really be able to take from the story and apply it to your own life, even if you haven't lived the exact events of that story. To find a theme, you have to examine how the protagonist or main character resolves a conflict. Then reflect on the reaction to the story. If the reaction to the story is positive, then the audience is supposed to act like the protagonist and do what he or she did. That's the message. If the reaction is negative or things turn out poorly because of that resolution, then the audience is supposed to react differently, perhaps even oppositely than that protagonist. Point of view. A couple terms will just pop to the end here. Point of view will define as the perspective from which the author tells the story. A story doesn't have to have a narrator. Three types we'll use for this course. First person, that's the I, me, my, mine kind of narration, where one character, could be major or minor, tells a story from personal experience. Third person limited means limited to the five senses. So we don't know what a character thinks or feels. It's always kept much like a documentary. Unless someone talks to the camera, we don't know really what they're thinking. The other type is third person all-knowing, also oftentimes referred to as omniscient. This is where the author's descriptions, including characters' unspoken thoughts and feelings. This also can add details that none of the characters or any of the other characters know. It's like someone can see inside the minds and hearts of all the characters and share that with the reader. That's a lot to take in 15 minutes of time. Feel free to go back and watch part of it again, but especially important, ask questions of your teacher to see what subtleties and nuances, especially if you can think of examples for some and not for other terms. That might be the best way to latch on to your understanding and build from there. As I'll always say, good hunting.